Hello and welcome to this lecture. Today I start my lecture with one statement: whether everything in the universe is toxic or not. So my statement starts with this thing that everything in the world is toxic, yes or no. We have to understand what is toxicity first. What is toxicity? And it is defined as or the word toxicity means poison, deadly, or dangerous. So, if we keep a definition of toxicity, can we say that all drugs are toxic? My answer is yes. These all drugs are toxic if you misuse or abuse them. So, if you misuse or abuse them, these are all toxic in nature. For example, I'm giving you a simple example of alcohol. Alcohol can be highly toxic in high doses. So if a person is drinking alcohol at high dose, it is toxic, which leads to respiratory depression. And what is meant by respiratory depression? It means that if a person drinking for long term, and then the patient can lead to respiratory arrest. The patient stop breathing, and it can lead to brain damage. This example also fall under the category of physiological toxicity. So we can take this example as physiological toxicity, but there is another kind of toxicity that everybody have possessed, and I have mentioned in the slide is behavior toxicity. And if you see the word behavioral toxicity, it leads the word from behavior. To compare the difference between behavior toxicity and physiological toxicity, I can give you an example for behavior toxicity. Like if a person is driving the car under the influence of alcohol, then what happens? Because a person is drinking alcohol, he may get an accident because of the influence of the alcohol. This is known as behavior toxicity. Whereas when we compare the same scenario, that by drinking alcohol, what will happen? If a person die because of the respiratory arrest, because his lungs are not working, not breathing, or the brain damage, it is physiological toxicity. Whereas behavior toxicity is driving the car under the influence of alcohol that leads to the traffic accident or road accident. So that's how we compare behavior toxicity and physiological toxicity. The next question is that why do we consider physiological toxicity to be a social problem? I also put this question in the discussion forum. Why we put this as a why we put physiological toxicity to be a social problem? My opinion in regarding is that it is a social problem because although if a person is drinking alcohol or using any abusive drugs, it's his own individual choice. But the problem is that if so many people are using the drugs or misusing the drugs, then what will happen? There will be a rush of these medical emergencies in the hospital, and that will affect the health infrastructure. For example, I just give you a simple example right now, coronavirus, that due to increased number of patients because of affecting from coronavirus, now the hospital are burdened and there are so many patients and there is lack of health facilities. What will happen then? Then there will be medical emergencies in the hospital. There are not enough beds for the patient to treat them. Same like the drugs. If the drugs has been misused in a larger population, then what will happen? It will affect the health system, insurance system, it will affect the productivity, and these all things are actually social issues in the society. So although it is an individual action by taking drug or alcohol, but as a whole in a society it can be dangerous to the society and can be destructive. Then the next thing is that type of toxicity. There are two different type of toxicity. One is acute toxicity and the second one is chronic toxicity. When we compare these acute and chronic toxicity, the difference is very simple. Acute is actually the sharp and intense toxicity that comes suddenly. For example, a person drink a high dose of alcohol and it can lead to behavior toxicity or it can lead to respiratory arrest. This is acute toxicity. Whereas in chronic toxicity, if a person is drinking for long term, maybe for years and years, then with the passage of time, his liver become damaged. In technical terms, we call liver cirrhosis. Okay, let's take a look of example of four type of drug-induced toxicity. As we already know that the toxicity could be divided into acute form and chronic form, and we are already divide them into behavior and physiological. When we take a look on acute toxicity and we take a look on behavior toxicity, we set an example of using alcohol, marijuana that impaired behaviors. What kind of behavior it could be? It could be such as lack of desire to perform the task, poor concentration, sense of apathy, and decrease in interest in social behaviors. And when we take about and when we take a look on physiological toxicity, there is an example of overdose of heroin that can lead to stop breathing. I already mentioned that if a person is drinking alcohol too much, respiratory arrest will occur and patient stop breathing. When we take a look of chronic toxicity and we compare with behavior and physiological, the behavior toxicity, it can lead to the motivational syndrome. The main thing is that if a patient having these all toxicity that I mentioned, lack of desire, poor concentration, lack of apathy, then a combination of all these things can lead to a syndrome known as amotivational syndrome, which occur if a person is drinking alcohol for longer term, maybe for years in high dosage. And when we compare what is the physiological toxicity, it could be leads to the heart disease, respiratory disease, lung diseases, because of the chronic exposure of alcohol. So that's how we compare the toxicities of acute and chronic toxicity. In simple terms, acute is immediate, whereas chronic is long-term injuries, long-term toxicities. So thank you so much for today's lecture.